All right, between Zuckbucks and social media sites, we saw what these big tech companies can do to an election should they want to involve themselves in it. We have a major midterm coming up in just a few months, and we have to decide what the future of big tech is going to be in this country. My next guest is the policy analyst for the Ethics and Public Policy Center, Claire Morrell. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, admittedly, amid gas prices, baby formula shortages, open borders, and January 6th, I have not fully invested myself in this 5-4 decision in the Supreme Court, which a lot of conservatives say is disappointing, related to a law that was passed in Texas. Can you fill us in?
Yes, so the Supreme Court last week issued a very disappointing ruling granting an emergency application filed on behalf of the tech companies to ask for the Texas social media law to remain enjoined. So a district court enjoined it. The Fifth Circuit overruled that district court and allowed it to go into effect, and they emergency appealed it up to the Supreme Court. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court allowed that emergency application to go forward and the law to essentially be blocked at this point. Now it's back at the Fifth Circuit, so this isn't a final ruling on whether or not that law will go into effect, but it is disappointing because I think it represents an excellent solution to big tech censorship.
Okay, so is it a question of whether or not this has to come from the federal government versus a state government? I mean, how would each state have a different law related to, the internet, which is global? I mean, wouldn't that be an interstate commerce clause thing?
No, you raise a good point. However, this body of law that Texas is using is common carrier law, and both the federal government and states are allowed to use this law to essentially regulate industries that serve as major communication or transportation channels to ensure that all customers have equal access. And so it's really a narrow provision. It's a non-discrimination law to say that these social media platforms, today's major communication channels, cannot block people based on their political or religious viewpoint, that all people deserve to have access to these platforms. So the federal government could certainly step in and do the same, but we haven't seen them willing to do that. And so Texas said, enough, we're going to take on big tech censorship ourselves, and they do have a right to do so. So that is what Texas has done.
Is there a big difference, though, between saying, okay, Twitter's a website, but you can still go on the internet, not go on Twitter, let's say, because, I mean, we've kind of been pushing back on the whole bake me a cake thing, right? I mean, pretty much the bake me a cake or else mentality has said, you have to bake me the cake that I want when I want it. And some bakeries have said, well, we don't want you to do it. We're not going to do that here, but you can go elsewhere. Nobody's stopping you from getting a cake. You just can't get it here.
I think the difference is that there are many different cake shops you could go to. And the social media platforms, there's really only a few dominant players. And so market dominance is actually one of the key tests for whether or not common carrier law should be imposed. So it's not just that they serve a public function, but it's that there's no alternatives to go to. And so because these major companies were kind of the first in the door, they've established a market dominance where most people are communicating on these few networks. And there are certainly alternatives, but if you really want your ideas and views to reach a wide audience, you're kind of forced to go to Twitter or to Facebook. And so because of their market dominant position, they are essentially functioning as today's public square, which is why Texas said, you can't discriminate against certain viewpoints being represented there or not.
Well, and look, I would be all about, I would probably be a little laissez-faire and more libertarian here if we didn't see tech companies deplatforming, let's say, Parler, right? Or using bandwidth to shove certain websites to the side. But, Twitter, part of its popularity is the CEO or was the CFO said, we are the free speech wing of the free speech party. In other words, they advertise themselves to all comers like, hey, this is a free speech platform. Then along the way, they said, thanks for helping us build the dominance of this. Now you're not welcome anymore.
No, exactly. That's the problem, is that they have clearly censored and silenced certain viewpoints over others. And so they're picking and choosing what speech is acceptable or not to us as Americans. And Texas rightly said, this isn't right. We need to make sure that all people have equal and fair access to have their viewpoints expressed and their ideas exchanged. And that is what they've done with this common carrier non-discrimination law.
You know what's also weird is you had people that, let's say, President Trump blocked. They said, well, you can't block me, that you're violating my First Amendment rights. And then Twitter just banned Trump, but left, let's say, Hamas up there. So, it's like you're telling me that Donald Trump is worse than Hamas?
No, precisely. And they're intervening. I mean, he was the leader of the United States. He was the president of the United States, and they took away his platform. It's just ridiculous that they're engaging in affecting so much our political discourse. And you made that point early on. We have a key election coming up in November. And so this really is a pressing issue that we need to make sure that in our democracy, all ideas and positions can be equally expressed and heard on these major communication channels.
Traditionally, conservatives say, look, it's a private business. It's their website. They can do what the heck they want with it, right? If they don't want to let somebody speak on their platform, we've often said, if you don't like that radio station, either turn the channel or start a radio station of your own. I mean, that's kind of been a boilerplate conservative view. Now we have this very sort of toxic environment in the tech world. And now Democrats who demanded transparency in corporations, diversity on corporate boards, they're saying, whoa, hold on a second. We like Mark Zuckerberg. I mean, he's helping us buy elections. We like Jack Dorsey. His people are kicking our political enemies off the website. So what was once a principle that we tried to adhere to seemed like we got a lot of mud in the face for it. Now the Democrats want to take that and say, now that's our position.
No, it's true. I think there's been a little bit of a flip-flop on this issue, but I will say that I think as conservatives, we rightly distrust big government and we want the free market to be able to function properly. But this is an occasion where the free market is not necessarily going to solve the problem. And you even pointed to Parler earlier. I mean, they said, go build your own platform, and Parler did, but then Amazon canceled its web services, and then Google and Apple said, oh, and you can't be on our app store. So there are these few companies that are really gatekeepers. And without addressing this from the government, there's not going to be, I think, a solution that the free market can come to on its own. And, this is a historical Republican position. Teddy Roosevelt was trust busting back in the early 1900s because he recognized we didn't want a country ruled by oligarchs. And so the threat is not always necessarily from big government intruding on our principles. It's also sometimes from oligarchic companies. And so I think that is why you're seeing Texas taking action like it has with this law, and others really raising the alarm that something needs to be done to address big tech.
Yeah, Democrats used to also complain about the handful of corporations that control the information we see. Now they've kind of, flipped those corporations in their favor. And they're like, now we love a handful of corporations controlling the information we see.
No, precisely. And honestly, I think that if the platforms were censoring the other direction, we would see the Democrats absolutely calling for these companies to be abolished. But since they've been able to get these, tech companies representing and helping their positions, really colluding and working together, really you've seen between the Democratic Party and these tech companies, the bias has been so clear that of course they're going to defend them at whatever cost. And so this is really why it's great to see states like Texas trying to do something about it.
And there was a different ruling in the 11th Circuit, right? Didn't the 11th Circuit say these are not common carriers? So is it going to be a matter of, we only got like 20 seconds, is it going to be a matter of different circuits having different opinions, and then that's when it goes to the Supreme Court? 20 seconds.
Correct. I do think that the circuit split would elevate this to the Supreme Court faster, and that is probably where it's headed.